Hello everyone, and welcome to the second in the mini lecture series on Introduction to Qualitative Evidence Synthesis. In part one, we looked at the origin of qualitative evidence synthesis. We saw some of the applications that it's been put to, and we looked at the bewildering amount of terminology that surrounds the particular study method. In this slide presentation, we're going to be looking at a number of issues. We're going to discuss how do you actually choose between the many different methods of qualitative synthesis. We're going to introduce you some key resources that you'll be able to use when conducting your own qualitative evidence synthesis. And we'll just touch on some of the contemporary debates regarding use of qualitative synthesis. And what we want to start with are some givens that we recognize that not all important questions can be answered by quantitative research, and therefore, as we identified in the previous lecture, qualitative research can help us to understand what people with a particular condition consider to be important, that we can understand what makes an intervention desirable, or indeed the reverse, what might make people not adhere to a particular intervention, or in the case of health professionals, not deliver it as planned, why an intervention may not work as well as it was anticipated to work, why that intervention doesn't work consistently across different contexts. And although people tend to characterize qualitative research as being about barriers and facilitators, there is far more to a qualitative evidence synthesis. But nevertheless, it can help us to look at barriers and facilitators to implementation. And with so many different routes that we can explore in relation to the qualitative research that we have at our disposal, then the idea is trying to target that bit of the question that is best answered by the resources that we have available. But I'd like you to start off by reflecting on the types of data that you might use within a qualitative evidence synthesis. And you may want to pause the recording here just to make a brief list of the types of data that you could synthesize as qualitative data in order to look for patterns across different studies. Resuming then, we can see the obvious is that you could use standalone qualitative research studies. These can be synthesized by theme, but don't really acknowledge the context from which they're taken. Obviously, a particular strength comes from our second category here, which is qualitative research studies that are nested in or alongside trials, so that they share the context with an effectiveness study, and so we can relate the findings from the qualitative research to the findings from the quantitative research. Mixed method studies that have been conceived as both qualitative and quantitative, giving equal weight to both components. You have process evaluation studies. Some of this might be quantitative, but a large part of this is process evaluation is qualitative. You think of individual case studies. These are qualitative research, and people have done syntheses of case studies. A more questionable area, survey and questionnaire data. Obviously, open-ended responses in a questionnaire is a form of text. It may be determined, however, by the questions that have previously been answered. It may be along the lines of, is there anything else you want to share? And it may be very limited in the amount of detail, and certainly would lack an explanation of why the person has recorded what they put there. But in terms of understanding phenomenon, then it may have a place. But perhaps things that you've not thought of, discussion sections in trial reports. These are qualitative, for example, why the trial didn't work. So, for example, a particular therapeutic food supplement for malnutrition may have had a disagreeable taste. This would add some context and understanding to the results of a trial in pure quantitative terms. And methods of qualitative synthesis can, of course, be used with government documents. So some of my colleagues have, for example, looked at how quality assurance has been captured in policy documents over many years. Of qualitative research has been highlighted for us by implication by Trish Greenhalgh, who wrote a memorable piece on why Cochrane reviews are boring. And what she points out is that when you do a quantitative effectiveness review, essentially you're stripping away the context that helps you to understand why the intervention behaves in the way it does, why the people receiving the intervention behave how they do. And so you end up with a focused experimental question that removes the messy context that helps us to understand what's going on. And so we can think of qualitative evidence synthesis as a way of putting that context back into our decision making, and if you like, putting flesh on the bones. The analogy that I've used before is nicely captured in this illustration here. This is a hypothetical product called dehydrated water, where water is turned into a powder, and then all you need to do in order to reconstitute it is add water. And to a certain extent, this is what we're doing within systematic reviews. We're stripping out the context, we're turning the results into a powder, if you like, and then we're looking for ways of reintroducing that context further down the review process, perhaps in our analysis and interpretation. And this particular article that I worked on behalf of the World Health Organization shows the different ways in which context can be built into the various tools that you use when undertaking systematic reviews. So in terms of some of the resources that are available, certainly a good starting point is the set of web pages by the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementations Group. They have various training resources and a core library of key articles. Other important resources, we mentioned in lecture 1 that Cochrane guidance have been produced and published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. You'll see that essentially this goes through the stages of question formulation, searching, protocol development, assessing for methodological limitations, quality assessment, data extraction and synthesis, and summarizing confidence in synthesized qualitative findings, along with special papers on assessing the evidence on implementation and on integrating qualitative and quantitative. And the series concludes with a paper on reporting guidelines for qualitative evidence synthesis. Last year, the Cochrane Handbook was released in its latest edition, and chapter 21 of that handbook is the overview of qualitative evidence. It's, if you like, the backdrop against which those 6 papers that I've just shown you can be considered, and so it gives us a good sort of prospectus of where we stand at the moment with the methodology, particularly in the context of qualitative reviews. And also in the previous lecture, we talked about the many resources that are available here. Here are some of the different types of resource. So we have a list of the books that are specifically on qualitative evidence synthesis, or in which it features prominently. We have the software in the form of Epi Reviewer from the Epicenter and Quarry from the Joanna Briggs Institute. And we have 4 of the key players here: the Epicenter in London, the Joanna Briggs Institute, a network across several countries, and then 2 further networks, the Cochrane collaboration and the Campbell collaboration, both of whom produce guidance for their series of reviews. And we mentioned that within Cochrane, preference is given to 3 particular methods. So I can point you to a supplementary video, one produced by my Cochrane colleagues, that covers the 3 methods of framework synthesis, thematic synthesis, and metaethnography, and talks about the advantages of them. The important thing to recognize, however, is that our decision to use different methods, and we saw earlier that there's a bewildering variety of methods, is determined by what we see as being the output or product from the process. So if our purpose is to aggregate, summarize, and integrate qualitative data linked to a specific intervention review, then relatively simple methods like thematic analysis allow us to aggregate findings from source papers. If, however, we're wanting to generate theory or to develop theory, then methods such as framework synthesis, which tests a theory in the form of a framework, or metaethnography or grounded theory that tries to generate theory from a blank page, if you like, become more useful. And a further possibility is that we may want to bring together the quantitative and the qualitative evidence, and that's seen in the pink pathway here on the right-hand side, with such methods as realist review and critical interpretive synthesis. Now, that was an early attempt to navigate the variety of choices. This is a more recent attempt as part of an HTA project for the European Union. I led a team that produced guidance on choosing qualitative evidence synthesis methods. It identified the different considerations that underpin the choice of methods, and this working paper, which is freely available on the web, was published in a brief form as an accompanying article in Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, as referenced there. And what this particular paper did was come up with the mnemonic or memory aid called Retreat, which talked about the 7 considerations that influence the choice of method. These are interpreted in the context just of qualitative synthesis, but you could argue they equally determine choice of quantitative reviews as well. So you have, first of all, the review question. Secondly, the epistemology or the theory of knowledge. How is knowledge to be used? Is it to advance theory? Is it to be aggregative? Is it to be configurative, etc.? The amount of time or time frame within which you're expected to deliver the review, and linked to this, the resources that you have, perhaps in terms of personnel and funding, the expertise in terms of to what extent are the team familiar with qualitative research, or to what extent are they having to follow a fairly simple template, the audience and purpose, so is it for decision making or is it for more for general enlightenment, and the type of data. If we only have thin data, then that means that our choice of methods is perhaps restricted, whereas thicker data will allow us to use methods that unpick context or help us to unpack theory. Now, a colleague of mine, Ruth Garside, has helped to characterize the stages of the qualitative synthesis by emphasizing that they're not as linear as within a quantitative review, and there's a degree of iteration here, but she analyzed different methods of systematic reviews of qualitative research and found that the same building blocks, if you like, exist even if they're configured in different ways according to different methods. And in the third lecture of this series, I use this particular structure to take you through a review that I did with my master's students. Some very useful documents here, and the slides are also available because I noticed that the final part here is cut off. But the EPOC group has produced a template for a QES protocol or review, which tells you what fields you should fill in for the different sections, and so this can be used as a starting point when writing your own review. NTREC and eMERGE are reporting guidelines. NTREC is a generic reporting guideline, whereas eMERGE is specifically for metaethnography. And the final one here that you can find by searching for this particular title on Google is a handbook of qualitative evidence synthesis methods produced by the Swedish technology agency SVU. And that same organization has also produced this very useful quality assessment checklist for assessing methodological limitations, not of an individual primary qualitative study, but more unusually of a qualitative evidence synthesis in its entirety. So this helps us see whether a review has been done well or not. And even though this is an experimental tool, it's unique of its kind at the moment, so is well worth checking out. But when we're trying to bring together qualitative research, we face a number of challenges, as already picked up by the Trish Greenhalgh quotation, that aggregation of qualitative research has been criticised for failing to grasp the contextual situated nature of social realities. When you're aggregating, you move away from the uniqueness of the particular situations. At a top level, this can lead to trite or commonplace explanations. It's only when you drill down to the next level of detail that you start to see things that are nuanced or meaningful, and it often causes problems when you're trying to integrate this within the interpretivist epistemology. The argument is that the qualitative research is designed in such a way to emphasize the particulars that by bringing the findings together, you're actually thinning out or diluting their whole value, and by doing so you lose the three V's there, the vitality, the viscerality, and the vicarism of the original studies. And just to conclude with some contemporary debates, you'll notice that many of these are very current references. So we're still struggling with the decision on should we conduct comprehensive searches or should we purposively sample. Interestingly, the EPOC group has produced some guidance on this that's available from their website. Should we quality assess qualitative research studies, and if so, what's an appropriate way to do this? How do we make sure that we're looking at the conduct of these studies and not just how they're reported? Should synthesis do more than simply aggregate the studies? So to what extent should its intention always be to add in levels of interpretation? Long-standing challenge, how do we integrate the quantitative and qualitative parts? And the article by Noyes presents some of the options, and there's quite a heated debate gone on between Thorne and Britton, and then back again to Thorne, on some of the controversies of the qualitative evidence synthesis endeavour. So I'll just conclude with some useful references for you to work through. You'll notice that the first two articles here are around this issue of purposive sampling, and then we have some material here on the limitations of simply aggregating the data. The second page of references here features some of the work around searching and quality assessment. It also includes an article by Dalton which summarizes a large set of sample qualitative evidence syntheses. We have references here, including the Greenhalgh one on why Cochrane reviews are so boring, and some of the key works on the right-hand side that have shaped the science of qualitative evidence synthesis. And finally, we have some of the debate that has been raging within qualitative health research on the value of qualitative synthesis, including the memorable title by Thorne here, Metasynthetic Madness, What Kind of Monster Have We Created? And on such a Frankenstein note, I'll conclude and look forward to resuming in the final lecture within this series, where we'll look at a published example.